Good morning, fifth grade. Welcome back, and we're going to be moving on today and learning how to multiply decimals by powers of 10. We're going to be kind of rewinding and reminding ourselves what it means to multiply decimals by decimals and how we remember to place the decimal. I think what you'll find as you watch this lesson is that the idea of multiplying decimals by powers of 10 is going to take us back a little ways to our zero trick in multiplication. So hopefully we can kind of build that connection as we move forward. Let's get started. I want to take a moment, friends, and remind you what powers of 10 are. Powers of 10 are numbers like 10, 100, 10 squared, 10 to the third power. So if you remember when we were back in multiplication learning our zero trick, we learned a trick for how to multiply by numbers like 10, 100, 10 squared, 10 to the third. So just to remind you, those are what powers of 10 are. We're going to see the pattern that begins to happen when we are multiplying decimals by powers of 10, like 10, 100, 10 squared, and so on. So I'm going to start, friends, by doing two different examples of multiplying a decimal by a power of 10. And then what I'm going to have you guys do is take a moment to sort of analyze what happens to the decimal point when we are multiplying by a power of 10. So I'm actually going to pause the video and solve this problem. I want you to pause the video and solve this problem in your math journal, just to get a little review and remind our brains how to multiply by decimals. So hopefully you paused the video and took a minute to solve. If you can see the work that I've done here, we're going to work together now to put our decimal points where they belong. So from what we know from before, when you are placing the decimal point in a multiplication equation after multiplying, you look at how many decimal places were in the original equation, which there were 2 in this number, and there were 0 in this number, which means in all I need to have 2 decimal places in my final number. So 32.25 times 10 is 322.5, or 322.50. So take a minute to compare where the decimal point was in this original number and where the decimal point is in this final number. I'm going to do another example, and we're going to see what we notice. Let's take a second and solve this second problem together. 24.7 times 10. So we're going to multiply the whole first round by 0, which we know 0 times 7 is 0, 0 times 4 is 0, 0 times 2 is 0. Second round of multiplication, we hold our place with a 0 and then multiply. 1 times 7 is 7, 1 times 4 is 4, 1 times 2 is 2, and then we add 0, 7, 4, 2. Now, we know the process for going back and putting our decimal points into our final answer. We have to figure out how many were in our original number. Number is original equation. So there was 1 decimal place in this number, 0 decimal places in this number. So that means we need 1 decimal place in our final answer. So 24.7 times 10 is 247.0, or just 247. So again, I want you to think, see if you can notice a pattern. What seems to be happening to the decimal place when we are multiplying by a power of 10? So we're going to take a second, friends, and pause the video, and I want you to think about what you seem to see happening to the decimal places. I want you to consider the original numbers that we started with, 32.25 and 24.7, and look at what we got in our final answers, 322.5 and 247. I want you to take a minute and write down, you'll be asked an Edpuzzle question in just a second. I want you to write down what pattern or what you believe is happening to the decimal point when you are multiplying by a power of 10. So friends, hopefully you were able to notice a pattern that when we were multiplying by 10, and there's 1 0 in the number 10, multiplying by the number 10, our decimal place moved over 1 place to the right. 32.25 became 322.5. 24.7 became 247.0. So hopefully you were able to notice that when multiplying by powers of 10, our decimal place is moving one place to, or the number of places to the right, as there are zeros in the original when you're multiplying by your power of 10. So what we're going to do is now apply this and multiply by, say, 100 and see if the same pattern applies. So let's take a look at the problem 24.7 times 100. So we know when we multiply by 0, our whole first round is going to be 0. We're going to hold our place with a 0 and do our second round. Again, multiplying by 0 is going to give us 0 times 7 is 0, 0 times 4, 0 times 2. Now, we haven't done very much of this, but when you multiply a third round, you hold your place with 2 zeros, and then multiply. 1 times 7 is 7, 1 times 4 is 4, 1 times 2 is 2. Add it all together, 0, 0, 7, 4, 2. So let's go back to our original equation and do what we know we need to do to figure out how many decimal places should be in our final answer. So 1 decimal place in this number, 0 in this number, which means there should only be 1 decimal place in our final answer. So let's do our comparison again and see if our pattern has worked out. Our original equation was 24.7 times 100. If we begin to kind of think of this as another zero trick, there were two zeros in our final equation. We're going to move our decimal place 2 places to the right. So 24.7, 2 places to the right, 1, 2, would give me my new number of 2,470. I want you to take a minute, friends, and in your journal solve these 3 problems: 0.54 times 10, 8.32 times 100, and 7.46 times 10 to the third. You can solve these, or I would like you to try to solve these using our sort of new pattern, the zero trick, if you will, and how you move your decimal place when multiplying decimals by powers of 10. However, you can check your work by doing standard multiplication, the up and down standard multiplication, just to check your work. But the idea here would be, friends, to understand the pattern and begin to apply sort of the zero trick pattern when multiplying decimals by powers of 10. Take a minute. You're going to be asked an Edpuzzle question to insert your answers, and then we'll move on and kind of review. So let's take a second and basically review what is the pattern or rule when multiplying decimals by powers of 10. You always have the option of doing standard multiplication, but this is now sort of a trick that you can use. If you look at your original equation, you can look at your power of 10 number and determine how many zeros are in that power of 10, and then simply move your decimal point that many places to the right. It is important that you remember to move the decimal point to the right, and this will be, you'll understand this a little bit more when we move on and do division by powers of 10, but you must remember to move your decimal point to the right. So if you kind of put that trick in your back pocket now, you can use that as we move forward in our multiplication of decimals chapter.